CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The World Today, live from CGTN in London. I'm Polly Middlehurst. Our top stories this hour. The EU backs down on its plan to restrict vaccines entering the UK through Northern Ireland, as the World Health Organization warns vaccine nationalism will just prolong the pandemic. Also today, France shuts its borders to non-EU countries, but stops short of another lockdown. And taxi. Berlin seniors get a free ride to vaccine centres. So the World Health Organization is warning that a vaccine nationalism will extend the coronavirus pandemic and has called for the free movement of jabs across the world. It comes as Europe reversed a plan to use emergency Brexit measures to restrict drug exports to the UK. Nicole Johnston reports.
There were fears that when COVID-19 vaccinations started, so would vaccine wars. And this week, the danger of vaccine nationalism became real.
If we hoard vaccines and if we're not sharing, there will be three major problems. One, I said it will be a catastrophic moral failure. And two, it keeps the pandemic burning. And three, very slow global economic recovery.
On Friday, the European Commission announced a COVID-19 export block targeting the UK, the US and Japan to protect its own limited supplies. The Commission then said it would trigger an article in its Brexit agreement with the UK, which could have seen checks at the border of Ireland and Northern Ireland to stop vaccines entering the UK. London, Dublin and Belfast were outraged, leading to late-night phone calls among the leaders.
This is an incredibly hostile and aggressive act by the European Union bloc. They are trying to stop the supply of a vaccine designed to save lives into the United Kingdom.
But by late Friday night, the European Union had backed down. It published a statement saying it wouldn't trigger the clause, but added, should transits of vaccines and active substances toward third countries be abused, the EU will consider using all the instruments at its disposal. In the world of diplomacy by tweets, there was relief, however. Ireland welcomed the reversal and said it was a positive development. But the issue of vaccine nationalism is far from resolved. AstraZeneca is still unable to supply all the doses right now that the European Union says it was promised. And the world's richest countries are faced with a dilemma. Do they prioritise their country's needs over the rest of the world? And in doing so risk damaging not only a global health recovery, but an economic one too. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
Well, let's talk right now to David Taylor. He's Emeritus Professor of Pharmaceutical and Public Health Policy at University College London. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Taylor. So we're hearing this phrase more and more, aren't we? Vaccine nationalism. What's your take on that?
I'm not sure it's terribly helpful. If we take it to mean people behaving selfishly, not talking to others, not communicating, not caring about the general principle that we're trying to beat a world pandemic, and that means, by and large, trying to get your vaccines as they become available. And remember, this is all terribly new. They're only just being licensed. Supply chains are being set up. It's not surprising there are teething problems. If we're trying to get the oldest, the most vulnerable served first, if you like, then we need to work across boundaries reasonably and respect one another. Understand that things will go wrong at first. Vaccine production is difficult, but once it's scaled up and established, then within a year or two, we will have the capacity to supply the whole world.
And you mentioned this being a typical teething problem, and you're right, the dispute, first of all, was between AstraZeneca and the EU about contracts, then supplies, and now borders. Do you see a way out of these kind of tensions?
I think the European Commission took on a purchasing role which it wasn't necessarily well equipped to do. It's not surprising because this is a unique once-in-a-lifetime situation. They discovered that there would be a supply problem. The details of the contracts I don't know, but it seems to me that when people say they make their best efforts, they've got to also be respecting the deals they've already made, and the Commission was relatively late in signing its contracts. They then fear a political situation, they fear member states becoming angry with them, and to some extent I think we've seen a political reaction, an attempt to perhaps scapegoat pharmaceutical companies, which happens all the time, companies to try and do a good job, but they're relatively easy to blame if things go wrong. That's, I think, what's gone on.
This is a political reaction, you're absolutely right, but it's based on an operational issue. What about the supply of vaccines being sped up across Europe to solve these kind of problems?
Doubtless people will be trying to speed it up. It's how we work most constructively together. If something's gone wrong in a plant, if filtration hasn't been done properly, the thing to do is to find out what's gone wrong as quickly as possible. Of course, if the UK were to have a surplus of vaccines it couldn't use in the short term, then sharing appropriately, and certainly in the longer term if problems persist, is right. But I'm not sure you approach that by public bullying. I suspect it's much more likely that lawyers looked at these agreements and decided they were worded in such a way that there was no legal obligation, but if you wanted to use the court of public opinion, then things like dawn raids on companies, etc., to some people sound good. I respect very much some people in the Commission who are saying, let's call this and let's work constructively as we can. The important thing to say, isn't it great that Chinese science, American science, German science, British science, etc., have helped to develop these vaccines, and let's work together as constructively as possible to get them out who need them most, remembering that in the first event, where the big death rates are, is actually at the moment in the developed countries. It's the developed countries with older populations. Parts of Europe, like Japan, have a quarter of the population aged 65 and over, the people at real risk. In India and sub-Saharan Africa, it's more like 3 to 5% of the population is older. All lives matter equally, that we should be serving populations in relation to the risk they're at.
Professor Taylor, thank you very much indeed. And there's plenty more on Europe's vaccine row, the threat of that vaccine nationalism to the global supply chain, all on our website, europe.cgtn.com. So France then is closing its borders to all countries outside the EU to try to limit the spread of new coronavirus variants. Essential travel, though, will be permitted. Ross Cullen is in Paris for us. Ross, how is this dispute about travel going to be solved?
Well, Polly, travel has already been severely impacted, and the EU has already strongly advised against all non-essential travel within Europe and outside Europe as well. And looking at the domestic situation, there are already heavy restrictions on people's movement. You can move around France freely during the day, but you have to be inside your home by 6 p.m, the start of the nightly curfew. And if you are outside your home after 6 p.m, you have to carry a government document with you. This is something that's been in place since mid-December, these restrictions on movement, and more than 110,000 fines have been handed out for people who are outside after 6 p.m. and not being able to explain to the police why they are moving around. Now, we had expected the President, Emmanuel Macron, to possibly announce a new lockdown tomorrow, but in the end, the Prime Minister spoke yesterday. And here's our report now, explaining a little bit more about some of the measures he outlined. No new lockdown for now in France. The government wary about imposing a full shutdown, but worried enough to announce tighter restrictions.
The question of a new lockdown legitimately arises given the latest data. We know that confinement has a big impact on the French people, and we think we can still give ourselves a chance to avoid another lockdown. That is why, in addition to the curfew, which has had an impact, but it's been limited, we've decided to take these additional measures.
de l'éviter.
Schools will stay open, but people should work from home if they can. Travel to and from non-EU countries will be banned, except for essential reasons, and anyone coming into France must have a negative PCR test. For some people in Paris, the move was seen as a holding measure ahead of a new lockdown in the future.
In my opinion, this is a preparation. Most French people are against another lockdown, so I think this is designed to get us ready for another lockdown in the coming days or weeks. I think a new confinement will be imposed for sure.
The biggest issue is that schools are staying open, as that could cause a big problem in terms of infections. But you have to find a good balance. I think these restrictions are going to last a long time.
I
think that if the infection rates go down, then we can succeed. But if the numbers stay the same or go up, then we're going to go back into the lockdown we had before.
This move shows the constantly changing feelings within government about the health situation. President Macron had been expected to announce a new lockdown this Sunday, but instead the Prime Minister spoke 2 days earlier and stopped short of imposing another confinement. The vaccine strategy in France is meant to be complementing restrictions, but now shortages in Europe mean the Greater Paris area and 2 other regions, which account for 1/3 of France's population, are postponing new first doses. Europe's first confirmed coronavirus case was recorded in France in January 2020. 1 year on, and the country is far behind its neighbours in terms of the vaccine strategy, under a travel ban and a nationwide curfew, and the government desperately trying to avoid a 3rd national lockdown. The government trying to avoid this new confinement, but it is on the table. It is one consideration that they are still bearing in mind. They are hoping, though, that the continuing curfew that is in place and also these new restrictions will be able to bring down the daily numbers of deaths and of new cases, which remain high. But if they are unable to do so, then it seems likely that France would have to impose a new 3rd national lockdown. Polly?
Ross Cullen, thanks very much indeed. Well, Germany's also banned most travellers from countries with more contagious coronavirus variants. The entry bans affect nations including Brazil, South Africa, Britain, Ireland and Portugal. There are several exceptions to the new rules, including people who have a right to live in Germany and those transporting goods. Italy's President Sergio Mattarella has asked his colleagues to mediate talks between parties in the collapsed government there. The former Premier, Matteo Renzi, withdrew his small Italia Viva party from the ruling coalition, resulting in the resignation of the Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte last week. Renzi has repeatedly clashed with Conte over the handling of the pandemic and the country's economic crisis. Thousands of people have protested for a 3rd night across Poland after a controversial abortion law came into effect. Abortion is now only allowed in cases of rape or incest or when pregnancy threatens the life of the mother. Demonstrators defied coronavirus restrictions and braved freezing temperatures to protest after the judgment was enforced on Wednesday. Still to come on The World Today. Playing on in a pandemic, the world's top tennis players go from quarantine to the court.
Don't forget you can sign up to our daily newsletter. We bring you all the top business headlines straight to your inbox. So sign up for free at this address. CGTN. See the difference.
The allocation of tiers will be reviewed
every 14 days, starting on the 16th of December.
And it will see some parts of the country move into even tougher limits on their lives than before the current lockdown. That's unlikely to go down well with some local leaders.
Since the beginning of November, admissions to intensive care units across Italy have almost doubled.
The UK government is well invested with 100 million doses pre-ordered as and when the vaccine becomes ready.
And of the disruption being caused by COVID-19, Germany's famous Christmas markets have all but been cancelled.
Welcome back. A reminder of our top stories on CGTN. The EU backs down on its plan to restrict vaccines entering the UK through Northern Ireland as the World Health Organization warns of the dangers of vaccine nationalism. And France shuts its borders to non-EU countries but rules out another lockdown. Experts from the World Health Organization are continuing their fieldwork in the Chinese city of Wuhan to study the possible origins of the coronavirus. In their second full day of work, the team visited an exhibition housed in a hall that had served as a makeshift hospital. It pays tribute to frontline workers who battled the pandemic. Earlier, the team visited one of the first hospitals to deal with patients early on in 2020. New York City will fail to meet its goal of administering 1 million COVID vaccine doses by the end of January. After a sluggish start, the city has now expanded capacity, but like elsewhere, the effort's been hampered by a lack of supply, something officials hope could soon change. CGTN's William Densley reports now from New York.
The COVID-19 vaccination effort is ramping up. Over 740,000 doses have now been administered in New York City. But officials say its goal of delivering 1 million shots by the end of January is out of reach.
There have been challenges, we know, with supply. So there have been times when appointments needed to be canceled, and that goes to something, related to this idea that it's unclear how much vaccine is actually available in a given week.
The city planned to open 250 vaccination sites to help roll out round-the-clock vaccines. Citi Field, home to the New York Mets baseball team, has been billed as a vaccination hub, capable of vaccinating up to 7,000 people per day. But the plan has been benched for now, due to a lack of vaccine supplies. But many vaccine centres across New York, like this one in Brooklyn, are up and running. And Mayor Bill de Blasio says the city will start receiving an extra 17,000 doses per week. That would push the weekly allotment above 120,000. Experts hope this is a sign of things to come, especially if more vaccine candidates get the green light for use.
Johnson & Johnson has contracted with the federal government to provide by June 100 million doses. So since this is a single shot regimen, that would mean 100 million people, which is really quite good.
With adequate supplies, the city claims to have the capacity to administer 500,000 shots per week. Mayor de Blasio says the federal government now needs to pressure pharmaceutical companies to speed up production.
All that matters is vaccinating the most Americans as quickly as possible, bringing life back, saving lives, getting our economy back, recovering. All those normal rules, all the concepts of corporate propriety and profit should be thrown out the window.
The target now is to vaccinate 5 million of the city's more than 8 million residents by June. If supply increases, officials are hopeful they've got a shot. William Denslow, CGTN, New York.
Now, a Russian court has ordered that several allies of the jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny be placed under house arrest. Part of a crackdown after tens of thousands joined unauthorized protests across Russia last Saturday demanding Navalny's release. Police have closed metro stations and streets near the Kremlin ahead of the planned protest this weekend. The opposition politician and his supporters accuse Vladimir Putin of mass corruption and cronyism, which the president denies. Indian farmers have gone on a day-long hunger strike to protest new agricultural laws which they say will benefit large companies at the expense of small farmers. The hunger strike coincides with the anniversary of the death of independence leader Mahatma Gandhi. Last week saw the most violent escalation in 2 months of largely peaceful protests. China's Xiaomi is challenging its blacklisting in the United States. It's filed a lawsuit against the US Departments of Defense and the Treasury. The smartphone maker is among 9 Chinese firms blacklisted for allegedly being linked to Chinese military. US investors are being forced to sell their shares in the companies by November. Xiaomi says it's stuck to the law and that its services and products are used for civilian or commercial purposes only. Now, up to 30,000 spectators will be allowed to attend the Australian Open each day for the first week. That's around half the usual number of fans. And that announcement comes as the majority of players leave quarantine and begin training for the Tennis Grand Slam, which begins in just over a week's time. CGTN's Greg Navarro has more now from Sydney.
Part of all this, once people arrived, about 1,000 players, support staff, officials were forced to go into a mandatory 14-day hotel quarantine period. That is something that is required of anybody who arrives here in Australia from overseas. Now, about 72 players actually had to go into a hard lockdown, meaning for those 14 days they were not allowed to leave their rooms at all for any reason, not to train, no reason whatsoever. The reason being they were on flights coming into Australia where they had at least cases. Now, at last check, many of those people were out of hotel quarantine. There's probably about less than a dozen people still serving. They're expected to get out within the next day or so. Once they've served that time, they are free to move about the city of Melbourne just like anybody else. Well, Victoria's Health Minister just released not too long ago the official numbers that the state is allowing the Australian Open to accommodate. So basically it goes like this: 30,000 people a day. Now, the Open had to meet several COVID-safe protocols. That includes specific seats, tickets for specific seats. Tickets would be sold in pods of 6 to ensure social distancing and so on. As far as masks go, the Australian Open says that is up to the state of Victoria, the health advice. And at this point, masks are not required in a lot of settings. They are, however, in indoor settings where you can't social distance and so on. But you have to remember that Australia is doing extremely well at the moment as far as COVID-19 is concerned. Borders for states are opening or are opened at the moment. In fact, the state is on a current 12-day run with no locally acquired cases.
Greg Navarro there reporting from Sydney. To Germany now, though, where many older people in Berlin have been missing out on their vaccination appointments due to lack of transport. Well, now a pilot scheme is in operation in the German capital to help both them and local taxi drivers. Evangelo Sipsas reports.
For Leszek Nadolski, this is one of the first rides in days. With fewer people going out over the last few months, he has certainly been feeling the impact of the pandemic. But today, his doors open again. Not for someone hailing him down to catch a ride to the airport, but for 2 special passengers. 85-year-old couple Ursula and Klaus have an appointment in Berlin city center to get vaccinated for COVID-19. But since they can't drive, they rely on others to get around.
The experience of the cab driver giving us a ride is better than if we try to get there ourselves. It's also difficult for us to find our way to the centre. And for many of my age, the legs no longer work so well.
Leszek is one of the many Berlin taxi drivers assisting pensioners across town and back to vaccination centers for free.
I was really happy that we could do our part to contain the pandemic, and I was also relieved that the elderly don't have to take the bus or the subway to the centre like that. Also, the orders we are getting now because of the vaccinations will help keep us afloat.
An agreement made earlier this month between the German Red Cross, the city's Senate Health Department, and the Berlin Taxi Union allows Berliners who are over 80 and have an appointment at one of the city's vaccination centers to take a taxi there free of charge. Although the fee is waived for seniors, the drivers still make their money. Throughout the ride, the taxi's meter will be running, but instead of going to the customer, the bill will be sent to the German Red Cross, who will pay the driver at the end of the month. For the German Red Cross, this initiative is the fastest and most secure way to get seniors vaccinated.
When we learned that the health department decided to vaccinate people over 90 years old, it was clear to us that these seniors cannot go alone by bus or public transport to the centres. We also realized that they will always need company, and having their loved ones with them could cause delays. Therefore, I spoke with the city senator, and we both came up with the idea.
When the rollout started, many Berliners were unwilling to go and get vaccinated. The offer of free taxi rides to some 18,000 seniors aims to make it easier for those that are most vulnerable to get protection from the virus. Evangelos Sipsas for CGTN, Berlin.
Now, lockdowns have exposed inequalities in access to public spaces. Well, that's the view, anyway, of the Royal Town Planning Institute, which represents planning professionals in the UK and in Ireland. It's calling for post-pandemic planning to focus on creating well-designed, attractive residential areas with good access to services and outdoor spaces. Well, Zhang Nini has been speaking to Dr. Yang Wei, the body's newly elected president, about future planning and her tenure as the first Chinese president of the group.
We need to ask and remind ourselves, for whom do we plan?
The new president finds herself leading this 100-year-old royal society in a changed world. In her inauguration speech, Dr. Yang Wei called for rethinking of relations between people, nature and economy in the post-pandemic era.
I think actually the pandemic really put us on the spotlight of inequalities and bias in our society. Because sometimes, or lots of times, actually urban development has been seen as a key driver for economic growth. But actually, this all comes with a very high cost.
Yang believes the pandemic has further widened the gap between rich and poor in terms of their access to social infrastructures in open spaces. As a town planner, she is an integrated approach to address the imbalance from the source.
When we think about urban development, normally there is a value related to land, related to the properties. But normally we don't give natural environment, a natural resource, a value. But actually there is a value because there is a limit. There's a global limit on our ecological boundaries. So we have to think about what is that limit. If without the ecological resource, we want to be able to survive.
The Beijing-born Yang Wei began her studies in University of Sheffield in 1999 when she came under the influence of the Garden City movement, which argued that development must not come at the cost of the environment. She has later started her own practice in London, focusing on human-scale development with long-term community benefits.
I feel actually the English society gave me lots of inspirations on how we can help to shape our society, especially the early pioneers in our profession who founded the garden cities. I think I learned a lot from them about the compassion and the selflessness in our planning profession. I think they give a very profound influence on my career.
With two major global climate policy events lined up in 2021, Yang is campaigning to make the planning profession more engaged in the dialogue. She believes a more holistic approach to planning could help to build a low-carbon lifestyle from the start. Zhang Yini, CGTN, London.
Well, that's it from all of us at The World Today. Thanks very much for watching. Coming up next on CGTN, it's The Agenda. From all here in London, goodbye.